Thank you very much, Dusty. I tell everyone that they're saying, oh, I heard you got to do the Thomas class. And I said, I would willingly inflict Thomas on anyone. I liked that verb, the inflicting of Thomas. I feel special devotion to Thomas. I'm a convert. I converted in Protestant seminary. My joke is that my Irish blood didn't like the idea of making money, so I converted. But Thomas Aquinas was very central in my conversion. My confirmation name is Thomas Aquinas. They tried to convince me just to say, just make it Thomas, Bo. It can be plenty of Thomases. I said, no, Thomas Aquinas, because of how important he was to me. So it's a great honor to get to teach about Thomas Aquinas at any time. I appreciate you guys giving me the honor to talk about him. So thank you very much for this opportunity. One thing to maybe alleviate you a bit there, you have huge chunks of paper. I kind of think for whatever reason Bonners must have something against trees. My dad always cuts down trees and I like making lots of print-offs. We're not going to necessarily go through all of those. I just like to give sort of extra material, so if something was maybe a little bit confusing, you're still thinking about it when you get home, that's stuff that you can read that deals with what we're going to talk about today. So maybe I'm a little bit idealistic, but I have this idea in mind that you'll go home and you'll love it so much, and it'll be 10:30 and you just need to read more Thomas. Maybe I'm ridiculous, but it's how it happens with me. What I want to start out with, I always like to make the joke that a lot of people lead with their best class, and then every class afterward is worse. And I always like to tell people, the first class, this will be the worst class. The rest of them will get better. So if you like it a little bit, you should definitely come back, because we have to establish things the first time that we go through. And with Thomas Aquinas, but especially the Summa, there's quite a bit to establish. I think I overheard some of you making the astute observation that Thomas Aquinas is hard enough to read that there's literally articles about how to read Thomas Aquinas. And that's true. When we advertise Thomas and you guys coming in and listening about the Summa and trying to make it where people can have a sort of introduction where they can get it in bite-sized pieces or something like this, I understand why Dusty puts it that way, but the complete answer I want to give you is the Summa is absolutely the worst work of Thomas Aquinas to start with, for good reason. The good reason is that people think it's doing something different than it really is. So my first ringing endorsement about my class is, you shouldn't read the Summa first. But you're here. No, I'm kidding. We'll get to why we need to approach the Summa differently. If what you're interested in is sort of the easy entrance to Thomas Aquinas, talking about matters of the church, you should get this book. The Aquinas Catechism is Thomas Aquinas talking about things that you find in a catechism in very brief, not shallow, but direct, clear language. He goes through each article of the Apostles' Creed. He goes through the Our Father. This is a treasure trove of catechism. If you want to know an answer, I want to know what Thomas thinks about something, it's better to look here, not the Summa. If you're interested in more about Thomas's sort of intellectual underpinnings, there's all sorts of beginner's guides. The one I happen to like is by a man named Edward Fesser. Still relatively, this isn't easy Sunday comic book reading, but it's still easier than the Summa in many ways. If you want to know about the context that Thomas Aquinas wrote in, someone like Alistair MacIntyre, God, Philosophy, and Universities. Something I would suggest. I have all these books up here if you want to go look at them later. If you want to deal with Thomistic philosophy in a sort of poetic, literary way, don't read Thomas, read Dante. The comedy is Thomistic poetry. It's what it is essentially. I would recommend everyone on earth to read Dante. If you want to sort of get a literary life of Thomas, then let me suggest G.K. Chesterton's dual books, St. Thomas and St. Francis. And if you really want to get at the heart of Thomas Aquinas, I still don't know if I would recommend the Summa. I would probably recommend his Eucharistic prayers, or in fact the entire office he writes for Corpus Christi. You want to know the heart of Thomas Aquinas? Read the hymns that he made for Corpus Christi. That's Thomas Aquinas. So good advertising, Bo, right? Lead with telling you that the book that we're going to talk about 3 times is not the thing you should start with. Well, let me rephrase that a bit. You shouldn't start with the Summa if what you want is tidbits or bullet points or abstract definitions from Thomas. It's not the thing where you go, well, I wonder what Thomas says about the Eucharist. And you go peruse the Summa, sitting under a nice fruit tree, drinking mojitos or whatever. The Summa has a different idea in mind, and that is precisely why it looks strange. This printout I have here, this is a question from the Summa, and it's strange looking. I know some people take different tacks about how you're supposed to go read Thomas Aquinas. There's Summas of the Summas by various people, and what they do is they eliminate the objections. That's what these things are. We'll talk about them in a little bit. Remove the reply to the objections, and just quote what they think is Thomas getting to the point. But the fact of the matter is the Summa is not about getting to the point. And I know that seems odd, because when we hear Summa Theologica, what we kind of Englishize it in our mind is the summation, right? The summary of theology. And I think that's what happens. People go, oh, a summary! And then they read this and they go, this is the worst summary ever. It doesn't summarize anything. Summa in Latin can mean various things. So summation or summary might be one of them. But more than anything, what Thomas is trying to get at is a sort of basic training manual. That's not what the word means, but that's what I'm telling you. What he has in mind is the Summa is his sort of summation of a longer process that the medieval universities used to train people to teach. It's a summary of what usually took 2 days to pull off. This paper right here, the single-leafed paper, I admit is mostly just to frighten you. We're not going to go over it very much. Because what this is the sort of detailed outline of what a medieval disputatio or a medieval disputation would look like in a medieval university. Like I said, this whole process would take 2 to 3 days. Some of you are going to be very bored within 15 minutes, but most of you go, hey, hour and a half. That's about as much of Bo as I can stand. Imagine 2 days of arguing. And in the medieval church and the universities, this is what you had to do to be a basic schoolman, is to be able to carry on an argument of either side for 2 days. 2 days worth of arguing. You start to see how for the Renaissance or the Reformation or people who wanted to talk smack on the church, it was easy to poke fun at people who would take 2 days to argue. What are they doing for 2 days? How inane must all these quibbling be? You can start to see where they would say, the university, it's a place to waste time when souls need saved. And there they are in the ivory tower having fights for 2 days. But for Thomas Aquinas and the university that he was raised in, Thomas Aquinas was a Benedictine oblate when he was a child, so he was far away from home from very early on. School was his life. And when he joined the Dominicans and went to the various universities in Europe, school was his life. It was his thing. It was the air he breathed. And the idea behind the schools was a matter of justice. We don't think about that too often, that matters of disputation would be a matter of justice, or that matters of truth have everything to do with justice. But if the basic definition of justice is to give each thing its due, then the truth has a claim of justice against us. By a matter of justice, we must pay attention to the truth with the requisite detail it takes. And the medieval university said, justice due to a point, to a truth, at least 2 days. At least 2 days of systematic argument. And when you went through the university system, they expected you to be able to argue either side of a point. Not so that you could impress your friends, but so that you learned humility. They weren't simply teaching them to be company men. They weren't simply supposed to repeat points that they learned from the teacher. Backwards and forwards, they were supposed to be able to know how to do justice to the truth. A 2-day process. I know I keep repeating this. But when you look at the Summa, what you have to realize is that if they had the ability to transcribe arguments back then, right? If Thomas Aquinas had one of these microphone puppies and they could amplify and record everything that they talked about, how many pages do you think 2 days of disputation take up? The Summa is 5 volumes long, hundreds of questions. How long would the Summa be if we, so to speak, had every single argument made? You might need a supercomputer to hold all of the different things said. When we approach the Summa, it is not a summary of theology. Strange enough, it's a summary of the arguments one would have about theology. What Thomas was expecting is that you wouldn't go to the Summa like you would an encyclopedia or a dictionary or a reference. Thomas wrote all sorts of other types of work. He wrote all sorts of wonderful sermons. It's really sad that we don't read as many of them as we do. He wrote commentaries on different biblical passages. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle. He wrote essays, what we would consider more like an essay. Thomas can be straightforward. It wasn't like this was some sort of problem Thomas had, like, Thomas, what do you want to eat? Objection 1, and he starts speaking like a weirdo. That's not what was going on. The Summa was actually shorthand for a practice that the schoolmen knew by heart, the matter of doing justice to the truth. So step 1 into being able to read the Summa profitably, for us who are not in Dominican universities in the 13th century, is to start to understand why it's different or what it's for. The Summa does not make the easiest bedtime reading. I would not read it to children unless you really wanted them to go to bed. By objection 4, most of them would pass out. You might pass out too, it depends. So we don't read it bedside reading. It's not, like I said, a reference. That's like I said, like catechisms and things like this. You read the Summa to be trained to think a particular way. Now, most of us don't think that that's why you would ever read a book. When we think of being trained to do something, to get in the habit of doing something, we usually think about that in the sort of term of physical activity, right? I need to get in the habit of waking up. I need to get in the habit of riding my bike. I need to train myself up to run a mile. I need to train myself to do a process. Well, we don't usually think of books as training exercises, except maybe something like math, right? So you do your math exercises. It's not quite like that, but maybe that puts us in the right frame of mind. Thomas does not think that if you read an article, that's what we have here. We have Article 1 of question 117 when we get to this point. Thomas doesn't think you'll go, oh, I need to know about teaching. This one's on teaching. I need to know about teaching. I'm going to go look at question 117, Article 1, and I'll be able to repeat back to you what Thomas thinks about teaching. Bam. Oh no. It's a much more difficult but profitable process that he's aiming at. Now the reason he's aiming at this is because Thomas thinks that there's already we have two different types of disputation or reasons that we would dispute with people. Reasons that we would have arguments with people, reasons we would have discussions with people. Thomas, in a different work of his, asks the question whether theological determinations, or just theological arguments, should be made from authority or from reason. Actually, a question that plagued a lot of the Middle Ages. They got in pretty big fights about this. You would get two completely different camps siding with one side or the other. What should we base our theological arguments on? Should they solely be based on authority, or should they solely be based on reason? You have people that say we should only refer to the Bible and a certain amount of church fathers, usually ending with someone like St. Augustine, he's somewhere up here, maybe all the way to St. Bede. But you have an ending point. You have the church, you have the Bible and the fathers, and if you can't appeal to them, you can't be correct. On the other side, you have people that say theology at its best is reason for the masses. And yes, this is in the Middle Ages. Averroes, who is an Islamic theologian philosopher, makes the argument that religion is for the masses. Islam, he says, is for people who are not good enough philosophers to know the truth. Now, he's not saying that he thinks Islam is wrong. He just thinks it's sort of philosophy simplified for the masses. And I know you go, really? They say this in the Middle Ages, because this sounds like an argument someone would make in 2014. But you should know from Solomon, nothing's new under the sun. We've been having basically the same arguments again and again and again, and here we have it. And guess what? When this all comes into Europe, people agree. Christianity, they say, is philosophy for dummies. It's nice, it's right, but it's simplified. Therefore, all theological disputes should try to deal as little with authorities as possible and instead deal with reason. And what's like a very typical problem in the history of thought, people chose sides, got in bitter fights, tried to excommunicate each other. This is Italy, things got pretty bad, stabbing each other, all the great stuff of soap operas. Thomas Aquinas, like his master Aristotle would say, is somewhere in the middle. Would be the mean, and the virtue is a mean between two extremes. On one hand, it's too much to say only authority works, and on the other, it makes no sense to say only reason works. And so Thomas tries to make a distinction that will explain when we should appeal to authority and when we should appeal to reason. And his distinction is based on your audience. Who are you talking to? And funny enough, which I think if you hear that, you go, okay, maybe I'm starting to formulate where he's going here, right? What he's going to say is if you're a Christian already, or a religious person, we'll appeal to the authority. But if not, we'll appeal to reason. And Thomas actually says the complete opposite. He says, look, if you're trying to convince people of the truth, Or as another way he puts it, if you're trying to correct error, if people are wrong, you can reason until you're blue in the face and they won't listen. Anybody ever tried to correct error? How'd that go? Who has a 100% batting average on that one? Teachers, if we can convince maybe 2 people a class, we're genius. Actually, funny enough, Thomas says, for people in error, and primarily he has in mind pagans, Muslims, and Jews, he said your arguments should be based on authority. So if you're dealing with heretics, other Christian heretics, and they had them, pretty soon the Dominicans are going to have to deal with the Albigensians. The Albigensians, I don't want to steal all of Dusty's thunder. He's going to have a talk about heretics. But the Albigensians, a time-honored heresy in Christianity, they were dualists. They thought the body was evil and the spirit was good. Guess what, Thomas says? If you're going to convince an Albigensian, where should you turn? The New Testament. They believe in the New Testament. They're just quoting it wrong. Heretics, you appeal to the authority of the New Testament. Jews and Muslims, what do they agree with us on? They agree with us on the Old Testament. You're going to have a disputation, you're going to dispute the errors of the Jews or the Muslims, says Thomas. Appeal to authority. They believe in some way in the Old Testament like we do. That's where your discussion, your dispute has to go. Dealing with a pagan, go back to the pagan authorities. Bring up Plato. Bring up Aristotle. We didn't know this at the time, but ostensibly, you go to China. Bring up Confucius. Bring up other people. Bring up the authorities that we share. Because that's how you have a dispute with someone who is in error. Like I said, that might seem counterintuitive. But the next one might seem even more counterintuitive. Who should you have disputes based on reason with? Believers. Believers, he says, if you want to have a dispute with them, already what you're admitting is you don't really disagree. And a master teaching his students, the students don't know enough to disagree, right? They know that they agree, they don't know how to formulate it. So if you're having a disputation with students, you want to appeal to reason almost exclusively, Thomas says. Now, why is that the case? This is where I think people really start to lose it with Thomas. You go, okay, maybe I understand. You try to find common ground in the authority with people who disagree, but why on earth would you only appeal to reason when dealing with people of the same faith? Otto Bird, that's a great name, right? Otto Bird. Anyway, that's who wrote this long essay I gave you. This is on page 143 if you want to follow along. He says, look, there's a second type of disputation. This disputation is not concerned with removing error, but instructing students that they may come to understand the truth. This second form of disputation is not to correct error, but to instruct students so that they can come to understand the truth. Taking from St. Anselm, he's up here somewhere too, the idea that faith is seeking understanding. And what do we mean when we say that faith is seeking understanding? We'll deal with this more in one of the subsequent classes, but just suffice it to say, Thomas Aquinas doesn't think that faith is like a smushy feeling or a sentiment. Faith is a knowledge. Indeed, for Thomas, faith is an absolute knowledge. To have faith is to know something absolutely. But it's still a different type of knowledge than understanding. Easy way to illustrate this. I always like to bring this one up. Do we rotate around the sun, or does the sun rotate around us? And the answer, you can all say yes, yes. The sun is in the center of the solar system, right? How do you know? Why do you believe that? Because let's be honest, observation-wise, you walk outside, you stay in one spot all day, you point at the sun. This would be very boring, your arm would hurt. But eventually it goes east to west, and you could sort of understand why people for thousands of years thought that the sun rotated around the earth, right? So why don't you believe that? Huh?
It doesn't make sense.
What?
What we can observe.
Well, what I observe, it makes loads of sense. The sun rises in the east and goes down in the west. So why do you know? You guys all know. I don't think we're going to get in a disagreement. How do you know? Or let me ask you another way. Do you understand why? It's okay to say no. I don't think any of you are astrophysicists. Is anybody an astrophysicist? Okay. So no one's losing their job not understanding what you were told, right? You were taught this. The actual real answer is stellar parallax. No one needs to go look that up unless you want to. We can get into a long discussion about that. But stellar parallax, we didn't discover until the mid-1800s. Otherwise, we based it on mathematical guesses. Now, my point only is this. You guys know the right answer. Most of us don't understand it. You see the slight difference here. Plenty of people know, well, let's back up. Some people know the Catholic faith. How many people understand it? Now look, I'm not bashing, understanding is not a prerequisite to get into heaven. I want you to think about the fact that the vast majority of Catholics that have existed on earth were illiterate and had no time to become theologians. What gets them into heaven? The simplicity of their faith. And let me guarantee you, heaven is filled with people with simple faith more than theologians. However, you and I have the great luxury of free time, right? My ancestors at 8:30 were still probably scooping up pig you-know-what. They didn't have time to sit in the air conditioning and talk this stuff out. They didn't have enough leisure time to wonder, to think, to observe, to ask. They didn't know how to read. They didn't have access to books. On and on and on, you see what I'm saying. We are most likely not simple Christians. So our faith needs to match our capacity. We need faith, but if it's possible, we need faith that seeks understanding. Understanding is to not only know something is the case, but to know why, to know how, to know, so to speak, the guts of the truth. Many of us know the skin of the truth. We can identify it if we're walking in a room. We're like, hey, truth, he's over there. But we don't know what's inside truth. We don't know the anatomy of the truths that we know. This teaches you, so to speak, the face of truth. If you want to know things about the faith, you read a catechism. And I think Thomas is great at this. It's very clear. It makes proper distinctions. You want to know the faith, read a catechism. You want to understand the faith, you need to be challenged. You need to be brought out of your comfort zone. You need a method. You need a teacher. You need someone to challenge you. Thomas says that when we are trying to instruct students to understand the faith, what they don't need is an authority, because let me tell you, if you are in a Dominican university in the 12th and 13th century, guess what you already believe? The authorities. And guess what you already probably know? The authorities. What you lack? Understanding. And to make someone understand their faith, you don't appeal to authority, you appeal to reason. And you convince them why our faith is reasonable. So for Thomas, this is not an either-or question. You don't either appeal to authority or reason. You use them for different circumstances. To correct error, appeal to authority. Specifically, authority we all share. You're trying to dispute with your students to instruct them in the understanding of their faith. Appeal to reason. The Summa is hard because Thomas is not primarily worried about what you know. He wants you to understand. It's different. The article that you have in front of you. Let me just do this real quick. This is the not as fun part. The Summa Theologica is split up into 4 different parts. In Latin, if you want to sound really cool, you say the prima pars, the prima secunda, the secunde secunda, and whatever, oh man, I'm blanking, whatever the third one. Yeah, there you go, thank you. In English, the first part, the first of the second part, the second of the second part, the third part. But if you want to impress your friends, say prima pars. They come in 5 volumes. This middle section is so long, it takes 3 volumes. Yeah, that's all I meant. I just was literally meaning library space, so excuse me. It's in 4 parts, though. This one that we're looking at, comes from the prima pars, the first part. Each part is then separated into questions, on down into how many ever questions there are. This one is question 117, which should start to show you the staggering amount of questions that are considered. And 117 is not the last one by a long shot. So we're in the prima pars, the first part, question 117, and then each of those questions are split up into articles, and they can range from usually 2 to 5, I think some have 8. What we're dealing with is Article 1. In notation, you'll see people take so what we're dealing with is prima pars, question 117, Article 1. And that, so, yet again, if you want to impress your friends, that's the notation. This kind of just shows you the architecture of the Summa. So when I say that this is prima pars, question 117, Article 1, I don't want you to think I'm trying to sound cool. That's just how you track down articles. What I'm more worried about today is I want to, especially starting out, I want to focus on the question that's being asked. So like I said, this is question 117. Now we just got done saying what Thomas wants is not knowledge but understanding. And the proof of this is the question he asks. I would have to say a staggering amount of them are questions you all know the answer to. Every one of you. And funny enough, this one's a kicker. Question 117 is whether one man can teach another. To put it a little simply, can people be taught? What's the answer? The answer is, I sure hope so, Thomas, because I'm sitting here in your class, presumably getting ready to be taught. And notice that this isn't question 1. This is the 117th question. So you've been through 116 questions, and then Thomas stops to ask, oh, by the way, can one man teach another? You're like, and that's one of those things where every student thinks it's a trick. Like, no? And he's like, no, yes. Of course it's yes. Good for you. You know an answer to a question in the Summa. But you knew it beforehand. Notice though, Thomas is not trying to teach you an answer. He wants you to understand the question. Much harder. And all it takes is us thinking about that in normal English that we start to realize that's the case. So I say, can one person teach another? And you go, of course, I've been taught my whole life. And then I would ask you, how does it work? And if we had time, we could get in a real fun fight. How does teaching work? A guy gets paid to get up there and yell. We sort of listen. I don't know. Have any of you ever tried to listen to your children explain to them what they learned at class that day? Son, what did you do at school? It's always, well, recess. Okay, then what? Lunch. Okay, but what did you learn? Oh, teacher read at us. I'm going to go play with my matchboxes. And you go, oh, and then you're a parent and you go, are they learning anything? And then one day you walk in and they're reading a book and you go, probably. I mean, I guess, right? You ever thought about how does someone learn language? That's the first teacher, right? What do you teach your kids all sorts of stuff. One of the first things you teach them is how to talk. How'd you do it?
Imitation.
But it's not just imitation, right?
There's lots of different methods and lots of different things involved in teaching.
And the proof that not only is there a lot of different methods, the other proof is that you don't have to know how to do it either, right? Essentially what we end up saying is, how do you teach a kid to talk? And like, you talk at it. That's where, parents always get to look stupid in the mall. Oh, how are you doing, little guy? Oh, are you hungry? And everyone's like, he's not going to talk back. He's a baby. But you have to do that, right? Okay, so my point is just, okay, you know the answer. Can one person teach another? Do you understand the answer? That's a different story. Thomas wants you to understand the things you already know. Now, what he could do is sit around and appeal to authorities all day. What he wants you to do, though, is reason through it. He wants you to think. He wants you to think about, what on earth do I actually understand about this question? And so step one that he does, and this is what frustrates the most people, is he starts with other people's arguments. Now, let's stop real quick and think about, like, if you're sitting under the shade tree and you're like, oh, what do you think about the election? Let's not really talk about this, but And then someone proceeds to tell you 8 different people's opinions but their own. What would you think of that? You're like, okay, great, Tom thinks that, Billy thinks that, Jane thinks that, what do you think? And then he keeps going, no, and then this is what Bill, You're like, no, just tell me what you think. And this is how Thomas starts. First of all, he asks you a dumb question you already know. Whether one man can teach another. And you go, yes. And then he goes, okay, I know you know it, let's understand it. First step, let's hear other people's arguments. Okay, you start to see how confusing, why people get confused, why this already sounds like you made the wrong decision about what class to sign up to. But before we even get there, I want to consider something as simple as the question itself. Whether one man can teach another. And to get in the spirit of Thomas, to try to make you rack your brains, I'm going to ask you, what's peculiar about the type of question, whether one man can teach another? I'll read off other ones. I got a few back here. Whether the reason is distinct from the intellect. Whether truth resides only in the intellect, composing and dividing. Whether the true and being are convertible terms. Whether good is logically prior to the true. What's unique about all of those questions? What's in common between all of them? There you go. Why is that important? The Latin, see, the Otto Bird gets into this. The Otto Bird, the main big essay here. The Latin for that is, where'd it go here? Utrum, yes, thank you. Utrum, whether. Why is that important? What's unique about that? Let's think of other question words. Why? How? When? Where? You can tell people you learned about questions in this class. Whether.
It does not say anything one way or the other as to what the answer is going to be, or what the correct answer may be. It says whether this or whether that. It's not making a decision in the front of the question.
Yeah, but even more important, I like how you put it, whether this or that. I like that the big word. Yeah, it can't be rhetorical, right? It's the or. If I say, what is a human being? How many different answers can you give me? But if I say, whether Bo is a man or not. What? Yeah, right, yeah, good, so we can make our objections, right? Let's not get into that. My dad would have all sorts of objections about why I'm not a real man. But at any rate, he teaches inside, right? At any rate. So why, how, rhetorical, right? And I understand what you're saying about they can even be leading. Whether is what he's going to call a dialectical question. That's how Otto Bird puts it. A dialectical question, which essentially means it cuts at a joint. It's one way or the other. An easy example of this. You're in the car with your spouse, I'm speaking of experience, and you go, honey, where should we eat for dinner? How long does this process take?
6 hours.
But if I say, I wouldn't put it this way, but you can imagine someone, honey, whether we should eat at La Gillette or Sweet Basil. That's a shorter conversation, right? With some distinction, with some understanding. I could have asked, how does a man teach another? And that's a completely different question than whether one man can teach another. Because now we have two sides of a debate, and all of a sudden now, what we have is this. The medieval disputatio, the 2-day disputation. And if you take time to read that later, I'm already droning on for time. If you take that time to read that later, what you'll see is that's precisely what happens. A master divides up a question into two sides. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, trying to make the case for either side, answering each other's objections, things like this. So, of course, that's what he tries to do here. This is a summary of theological arguments. So he's going to imitate what the disputation looks like. But notice that this has a lot more to do with reason than necessarily authority already. You can answer some whether questions by authority. They're uninteresting ones. Whether Augustine said this or that. And he excludes those as dialectical questions. But most of the time, if we're going to make a distinction, and if there's anything philosophy is about, it's making distinctions, you have to ask whether it is one thing or another. Yes?
Is there a presumption when you ask these questions that there is a correct answer or truth?
I would have to say yes, because he's usually asking questions like I say most people know. So he's assuming that you've had training in some other way, that you'd largely know most of these questions. Not all of them, I'll admit. Some of them were open, they were cans of worms at the time. So whether there were universals or not. No.
I'm just asking a question about the process.
Yes.
That's what this seems to be.
Well, so what happens ultimately is the master will decide two things: who made the better argument, and whether the argument holds up ultimately.
But in a debate, there's not necessarily an assumed correct answer.
In a modern debate, there's not.
That's right.
So there's two, since you brought it up, I'll make a slight distinction myself. Two types of things get brought up in the Summa. One is what we would call necessary demonstrations. And not going too much more of that, all that means is there's some things that if they're true, they have to be that way. So if you say a human being is alive, to be a human being is to be living. That has to necessarily be the case. by our definition of what it means to be a human being. When human beings die, what you have now is a corpse. It's different than a human being. It's necessary. You see what I'm saying? A lot of the questions in the Summa are necessary answers that can be demonstrated. And so, yes, mostly what's going on is the exercise of understanding instead of figuring out an answer. Others are what he would call fitting. An important word for Thomas. So the distinction here is fitting or necessary. A necessary question is one that is determined. It has to be that way if it's the case. A fitting thing does not have what you would call, the big word is metaphysical necessity, but what we mean is that it would be possible to imagine it being a different way. A big one Thomas points out, maybe this will clear it up. The incarnation of Jesus Christ is not necessary, but it's fitting. It's not necessary because God could have done anything different. Just like the creation of human beings, not necessary. God could create a world without human beings. But Thomas argues that both are fitting. Jesus Christ becoming incarnate is fitting because of the case of our need of a Savior. God creating human beings is fitting because we are the natural sort of mediator between the spirit world and the material world. Does that make a little bit of sense, the distinction between something that's necessary? It's almost logically has to be the case. And fitting things. Things that might not necessarily have to be the case, but are fitting given the circumstance. And the questions in the Summa are almost always one of those two things. It's either knowledge that necessarily must be the case, or it's knowledge that is fitting, that we could imagine it being another way, but not in the circumstances that we live in. You were just going to ask a simple question, and then I went on for 10 minutes.
One of the things, your examples that you just cited, though, raised another question that I had earlier. The incarnation. There are some things that I have been taught from the catechism onward in my Catholic instruction. There are mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And we can accept them by faith that they're true, but we can't necessarily know or understand.
That's great. I was going to bring it up later, but we'll bring it up now because it's a good point. Even in that, so let's think of one that Thomas is famous for, transubstantiation. What happens in the Eucharist? You cannot ever explain totally the Eucharist. Thomas admits as much. It is a mystery. However, utilizing reason, we can talk about the fittingness of the Eucharist, and we can defend it against claims of irrationality. That's not the same as explaining it completely, but it is something. In fact, it's a lot. The questions about transubstantiation came up precisely because some people were accusing Christians of cannibalism. You literally drink the blood and eat the flesh of Jesus Christ, you're a cannibal. How do we fix that problem? Thomas, and note, there are people, certain Protestants, certain Eastern Orthodox people accuse Thomas of explaining a mystery, but that's not what transubstantiation does. Transubstantiation uses reason to understand a truth that we could never know on our own. Do you see the distinction? Yeah. The Eucharist had to be revealed to us. But utilizing reason, we can understand a lot about it. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's no appeal to authority that will ultimately make someone believe in the Eucharist. That's faith, right? Faith in the end, God working on the human themselves would make them believe in the Eucharist. But I can make an atheist believe that if the faith is true, transubstantiation follows. And I know this happens in history. Atheists who do not believe, but say if the Eucharist were real, it must be transubstantiation. You see the differentiation there? The Catechism makes you know things. The Summa's goal is to make you understand. The Summa's goal is to mess with your mind so you dig a little deeper. I always tell my philosophy students this, but this is absolutely true for anyone who would read the Summa. If you walk away from it and you're not confused, you didn't read it close enough. If you walk away reading the Summa and go like, problem solved, you didn't read it, not well enough. Thomas's hope, earnest hope with every question, is to confuse you some. Because he wants you to dig the next level deeper. That's why you can read the Summa endlessly. Because the point of the Summa is not to read and go like, I know the answer that the Summa says. And I'll tell you, one of the main reasons that Thomas fell out of favor for a while, they make too big of a deal of this. I don't want to get into the complete politics of this, but starting in the late 1800s, you start to hear people talk about the manualists. And what they meant was, instead of reading Thomas himself, they would read manuals that would summarize the Summa. And so they would give arguments from memory about what they knew Thomas said. This is very much so a caricature of a lot of the best people of that era. If you want to learn a cool French name, Garrigou-Lagrange is this guy who he gets mercilessly bashed in the 1950s and 60s. Garrigou-Lagrange is wonderful, one of the smartest men that ever lived. But a lot of lowlights that attached themselves to Garrigou-Lagrange made his movement look bad. Why did they do that? Because instead of dealing and wrestling with Thomas as Thomas intended, they tried to make Thomas into bullet points. And they got into big fights with people with what I will say is the bullet point version of Thomas. And it's ludicrous. That's not the point. Point of the Summa, mess with your mind, blow a gasket, make you angry, make you have to walk away, come back to it. Because we're not interested in knowledge, we're interested in understanding. Can one man teach another? Sure. Why? How? How do we know this? So we parse it down into a dialectical question. Whether one man can teach another. Can they be taught or not? And when you parse it down this way, it's like a word that you say too much that it starts to sound weird. Radio. Am I saying it right? Radio. Right, it happens. We start to think about these things in very basic ways, and we start to go, this thing that I thought I knew, maybe I don't know. And so Thomas does this. This is why he starts next with the objections. It's not enough for you to hear what he has to say. He says, let's think about what the two sides would say. So we have a question that's dialectical. Whether one man can teach another. What are the two sides? Yes? No. The objections, choose one side, and then what the said contra, what is usually the on the contrary, chooses the other. And you'll see here, right? Objection 1, objection 2, objection 3, objection 4, on the contrary. These are little summaries that if it was the disputation, if you were like day 1, would be the top half of an article in the Summa. A little deeper version of the Summa, they have these things called the disputations, like the disputations on truth. I have a quote from one of those. The disputation on truth, there will be like 40 questions on one side and 18 on the other. 40 pro, 18 con. Those are hard to read. Those get even more difficult. Here Thomas is giving you a taste of both sides. Yes, no. In this particular one, the objection side with the no part of the question. Whether one man can teach another, the objections are going to go for the no side. So let's hear them. Because, right, you guys are like, of course people can teach another. So Thomas is like, okay, well, let's hear people who would say opposite. Objection 1. It would seem that one man cannot teach another, For the Lord says, Matthew 22:8, Be not ye called rabbi, on which the gloss of Jerome says, Lest ye give to men the honor due to God. Now, I know that's an authority, but here's the reason part. Therefore, to be a master is properly an honor due to God, but it belongs to a master to teach. Therefore, man cannot teach, and this is proper to God. Objection 1 out of the gate. Thomas tries to turn the sword on the students and are saying, oh, you think you can teach? Sounds to me like only God can. Then you start going, maybe I can't be taught. Maybe God just delivers messages to my mind. Now, for the lay reader, that's enough to consider. Like, okay, is God really only the essential teacher? If you knew, and you can delve deeper, if you knew medieval history, there were people who taught this. Remember that argument between authority and reason I just told you about? Basically, that's what the people who were pro-reason and pro-authority and anti-reason were saying. Only God can properly teach. People came up with elaborate theories to say, at most, teachers only, it was like they passed the bucket on, and that was it. Teaching was nothing proper. It was simply putting into empty heads factoids that they hadn't learned yet. Where did those factoids come from? God. Okay, maybe people can't teach. Objection 2. Further, if one man teaches another, this is only inasmuch as he acts through his own knowledge, so as to cause knowledge in the other. But a quality through which anyone acts so as to produce his like is an active quality. Therefore, it follows that knowledge is an active quality, just as heat is. This one's a little more confusing. I don't want to belabor the point too much. But what he's trying to get at is, if I had a torch, and I'm like, I'm going to burn your house down, and I burn the house down, sure, you can say Bo burned my house down, but what burned the house down? The fire did. And so what this objection is saying is like, okay, sure, you can say Bo taught you, but what you meant was Bo's knowledge taught you. And so properly, Bo doesn't teach you. And now you're like, man, maybe no one does teach anyone. We got 2 more objections. Objection 3, further, for knowledge we require intellectual light and the species of the thing understood. But a man cannot cause either of these in another man. Therefore, a man cannot by teaching cause knowledge in another man. What he means here is we have to have a way to be illuminated. That's what he means by intellectual light. There has to be some way that we come to know things. And then he says, the species of the thing understood. And in a very shorthanded way, what he means is you have to come across an individual instance of a thing. So properly, if you want to know what a dog is, you've had to come across a dog yourself. Like if you'd never seen a dog, I could tell you about a dog, but when do you really know what a dog is? When you see it. And he's saying human beings can't provide that for others. So again, we can't teach each other. 4th objection. Further, the teacher does nothing in regard to a disciple save to propose to him certain signs so as to signify something by words and gestures. He then goes on, I'm not going to, this one's kind of long, but he's basically saying a sort of variation of objection 2. Essentially he's saying, Bo doesn't teach you, the language Bo uses teaches you. Therefore, no one teaches another person. Now, I choose this article first on purpose because this seems real silly. Because I'm teaching you a class, and Thomas was teaching them a class, and this question he asks is, can one person teach another? And then in the course of teaching, he's giving arguments about how it doesn't work. And this is precisely the confusing, messing with your mind that Thomas is trying to get at. Am I being taught right now? What a weird question, right? On the contrary, the apostle says, whereunto I am appointed a preacher and an apostle, a doctor of the Gentiles in faith and truth. And I'll be honest, here usually with the sed contra, Thomas throws out an authority that seems to be teaching opposite to what the objections are saying. And again, this is because he's just throwing out a shorthand. If this was actually taking place in a medieval university, there would be students on one side and students on the other. But so he just throws out Timothy to say, well, all of these 4 objections say no. It looks like St. Timothy, or Paul is saying yes. And that would be day 1 if you were watching a medieval disputation. Right? Very anticlimactic, right? Tune in next time to the same channel. Now go to sleep and wake up tomorrow and hear what the master has to say about it. We're reading this to try to get at understanding. Now, why does showing 2 sides of a question you already know to the answer help you understand? And the analogy to me is something like, why, when we're trying to build our body up, do we first break it down? What makes you stronger? Strangely enough, making your body weaker makes it stronger. What do I mean by this? You have to lift weights in order to get stronger, right? You break down muscles to make them come back stronger, more capable to lift more weight. If you want to be able to run a mile, but you can only run a quarter of a mile, you have to run a quarter, then you have to run a half, then you have to run 3/4, right? You have to break yourself down before your body builds itself back up. Break it down more, build it more. This is the physical sort of reality that we deal with. We will not get to a deeper, better level in our bodies unless we first are willing to break them down. Something similar happens with your mind. Your mind will not improve unless we break it down first. You will not get understanding, funny enough, unless you are most likely confused first. That seems disheartening, but I like to think of this as a very positive achievement because I've been confused a lot in my life. And what I used to think is, oh, you're confused a lot, Bo, you're an idiot. But Thomas goes like, you're confused a lot, Bo, you're a philosopher. You're not going to get paid loads of money, but you have a job. Be confused well. Life's confusing. And the more we think about stuff we know really well, we can confuse ourselves on that too. But what Thomas says is if we utilize reason to evaluate our confusion, oftentimes we'll come out on the other side with understanding. So that's what he's going to do with the second half of articles in the Summa. The first half, the objections, and on the contrary, are a summation of the first day of arguing, the 2 sides, the yes and the no. The I answer that is the master giving his response. Which argument is better? Which one makes sense? So let's go ahead and attack this. Can one man teach another? Part of this is a matter of justice. Thomas actually, one of the reasons that I think he's rightfully as famous as he is not only because he's well read and not only because he summarizes and synthesizes, but he's more than willing to actually engage and even give the benefit of the doubt to his opponent before he then shows why their theory doesn't work. So he goes, I answer that on this question there has been various opinions. Thank you, Thomas. So he brings up Averroes. I've already brought him up before, the very famous Islamic philosopher. So he's commenting on Aristotle, and what he maintains is what this says, that all men have one passive intellect in common. Now, funny enough, what Averroes argues is a lot like what we mean when we talk about the cloud. I'm really bad about technology, so I'm sorry for bringing up a technological idea myself. But you think about the internet. I know you're like, came here to get away from the internet. But think about the internet. Where is all the information Google has? It's not in your computer, right? It's not in the particular computer. It's in the cloud, right? It's somewhere on a server in which multiple computers can access. Averroes literally thought this is how you learn stuff. Averroes literally thought that human beings all shared one intellect. This is a variation of philosophers before him, but hear him out. He goes, look, there's this one intellect that all humanity has, and each individual person passively shares in it. Passively shares in it. So that means what teaching essentially is making you access the intellect that we all share. Funny enough, you're like, whatever, man, that sounds weird. Except, man, that's how we teach kids to do research. I see it. How do we teach kids in school to do research? We don't say like, hey, go really understand something. We go, here's how you go find it in the library, on the computer, wherever. And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying we act as if Averroes is right. It's just that our intellect is not, in God or something like Averroes thought. It's at Google. If you really want to have fun with people, when they want to check something on Google, say, check Averroes. They won't know what you're talking about, but you can laugh. That's essentially what we do. We go, you don't need to know anything. You don't need to understand anything, Billy. Billy, you need to know to where to go access the information. And Averroes says that's what human beings do. They never have their own knowledge. They access the common knowledge they have. So, do people teach each other? Averroes would say they teach the methods for accessing the knowledge, but they really don't teach. Now Thomas says, this opinion is true so far as knowledge is the same in the disciple and the master. So he goes, look, the Averroists have this point. Let's act like, I'm not acting like this will happen, but let's act like after 3 times meeting, you really understand some of this stuff. I know, funny, right? But let's act like you understand it. If you understand it, you and I, we would all have the same understanding. You see what I mean? We couldn't all have different understandings because then some of us are wrong. You get what I'm pointing at here? The knowledge and the understanding between the disciple and the master are the same. Thomas goes, this is a good point. Because what some people want to say is, no, it's not. Each knowledge is individual. This is relativism, right? That means we never share any knowledge in common. That would be devastating for the idea of teaching, right? If every truth is your own personal truth and my personal truth and your personal truth, guess what never happens? Teaching. So he goes, the Averroists have a point. The knowledge in the master is the same as the knowledge in the disciple. But so far as he maintains that all men have but one passive intellect and the same intelligible species, differing only as to various phantasms, his opinion is false as stated as above. To sum that up, he's just saying, he makes the point, that there's a real way in which we learn as individuals. He's going to get to that a little bit more. Besides the Averroists, there's the Platonists, which held that our souls are possessed of knowledge from the very beginning through the participation of separate forms. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Socrates and Plato, but what the Platonists argue is before you were born, before you had a body, your soul lived in the eternal realm. And in the eternal realm, you saw the true form of everything. Dogs, math, God, the whole shebang. Before you were born, you knew absolutely everything. And what the Platonists maintain is when you are born and you receive a body, it either weighs the soul down or it disrupts the soul, or in some way what happens is you basically get amnesia and you forget what you knew. And all teaching is, according to the Platonists, is reminding you of what you forgot. Again, this can sound crazy until we look at something like the history of human knowledge. And we start to see things like history repeats itself, and it seems like no one learns valuable lessons, and what goes around comes around. And as Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. And eventually what we go like, well, maybe really all we're ever doing is reminding ourselves what some ancestor already knew, but we've forgotten. You start to go, Okay, maybe Plato himself isn't exactly right, but maybe that's all knowledge is remembering forgotten things, jumbling them in new packages. If you ever have the misfortune of dealing with academia, which I hope God spares all of you, that's what it starts to look like. Is what you have to hope is that you catch on a fad that people have forgotten. You'll start to see this, right? Like every 80 years, some new thing becomes cool again. And if you're on the rising tide of that, you get professorships. If you're on the back end of it, not so much. Maybe the Platonists are right. But against this, we've proved above that the passive intellect of the human soul is pure potentiality to intelligibility. So, yet again, we'll deal with this here in a second, what he's getting at. We must therefore decide the question differently by saying that the teacher causes knowledge in the learner by reducing him from potentiality to act, as the philosopher says. So this is his answer, but this is obviously going to confuse you because you guys don't talk about potentiality and act very much. But I do think some of you might sort of understand this in a different way. His argument is what it means to learn is to reduce a potential to an actuality. Before we get there, I want to ask you, what other sorts of things do you reduce from a potential to an actuality? What's another activity you do where you act, like where one of the actions you do is called reducing or reduction? Cooking. No, this is what I mean exactly. What does it mean to reduce in cooking? This shows you that not enough people cook. No, I'm kidding. I tell this to students and they're like, is this macaroni and cheese? Because I don't understand it otherwise. So how do we make roux, or how do we make really good, soups and stews? We put in stuff that's sort of potentially a broth, and we put it on heat to reduce it to make actual what exists potential. Now, heat is the thing that makes that happen, but what makes the food is you reduce it from a potentiality, something that it can become, and you make it actual, and this is called reduction. And I haven't followed this out completely, but I think the two terms are related, because this is what he's arguing happens when you learn something. What he wants to say is that potentially existent in all of you is knowledge. You have the capacity to know all sorts of things. I was going to go over this more with a fine-tooth comb, but I'm rambling and already running out of time. So just to summarize what I was going to get at, he's going to say, look, in a way, the soul is possible of being anything, because the soul, either through observation or learning, can become like anything on earth. Like I said, to jump ahead a bit, Thomas's definition of truth rests on the word adequate. A lot of us like to think that truth is like a light switch. Something's either true or false. You know it or you don't. And then you get these problems, right? What about gray areas? Where it's like, well, I kind of know it, but I don't. And then people go, maybe there is no truth because there's gray areas, and, college type problems. Thomas doesn't think that truth is like a light switch. It's not a matter of flipping on true or false, know it or you don't. What he says is that truth is the adequation of the mind to its object. Another way to say this, just in a slightly different way, is you know something when your mind becomes adequate to it or equal to it. Another way to say this is you can become more adequate to a truth. We actually believe this in all sorts of other fields in human life. If I ask you, are you healthy or not? Well, you go, well, depends on what you mean. If I said I'm healthy, people go like, Bo, you're not healthy. You're big. Dusty made this point by putting sumo wrestlers on on Facebook. Anyway, I'm joking. They go like, Bo, you're not healthy. And I'm like, oh, you should have seen me last year. I'm more adequate to health. Right? Okay, so health is something that's a matter of adequacy, right? We become more and more adequate to health.
Is this getting close to relativism?
No, because when we talk about adequation to truth, it's not a matter of differences of opinion. It's not a matter of your truth or mine. It's about proximity to the truth. So another way to think about it, if we walked in and the room was dark, and you could see a figure up here at the podium, do you know stuff about me or not? And you go like, well, yeah, I know some true things about him. It's a human. Presumably it looks male, needs to go on a diet, certain things like this. If we turned on one light, maybe you know more about me, right? You're more adequate to the truth. Like if you're imagining you had to describe the figure in the room, you go like, well, they looked like they had light skin. They looked like they had a long sleeve shirt on. Now imagine you turn on all the lights and you can go, oh, that's Bo. So notice how that's an increase in adequate, but it's not relative. When it's darker, there's more possibility for disagreement. That's true. But the closer that we get, the more adequate that we get, the more all of these descriptions will align. Again, I like to bring up is the sun the center of the solar system or the earth? In a real way, I don't want to consign everyone in the Middle Ages as to being wrong about the sun-earth dispute. Because there is a real way the sun rotates around the earth. At least in proximate relativity to my position standing here, right? It's not ludicrous to say, earlier the sun was in the east and later it was in the west. There's some truth to that, right? The problem is not that they were completely false, although they were plenty false. The fact of the matter is now we are more adequate to the truth. Because now we can not only explain how the celestial bodies actually exist in relationship to each other, but we can also explain why we thought different beforehand. That's not relativism, that's becoming more and more adequate to a truth. Does that...
That's not the truth.
Well, it's definitely not completely vacuous of the truth.
But I understand the concept of proximity.
I mean, this is what Thomas says. When we know something, it's because we are adequate to the thing itself. So when we were bringing up the difference between knowledge and understanding, when you know an answer, you truly know it. But when you understand something, there's a way in which the truth of it is you are more adequate to the truth of it. So it's not only proximity, it's like depth. Does that make sense too?
It's not true.
Well, it is true.
Well, it's closer to it.
Like let's just think about right here. If I asked you, can one person teach another? And you said yes. Is that true or false? That's true.
In my mind,
It's true. It's true one person can teach another.
my adequation of my mind to that knowledge says yes.
Well, it's true because it's the case. It is the case that one person can teach another, and whether you understand that or not, what you're saying is true. But there's a way you are more adequate to the truth if you understand it plus knowing it.
So is there an objective falsehood?
Yes, of course. Because to be false is to have absolute... an objective falsehood would say you have no adequation to the object at all. And look, this is the question. Can one man teach another? If you say no, you're wrong. You're not adequate to the truth at all. Now, if you throw out a reason maybe why you think it's wrong and it's something like Averroes, Thomas is going, okay, they're right to say, like he says, they're right to say that the knowledge is the same between the master and the student. But their picture is not completely adequate. That's not relativism. Thomas Aquinas, my goodness, if he's a relativist, we're all doomed. What people classically call this is the correspondence theory of truth, but I don't think that does it justice. It's the adequation theory of truth. It's about our minds becoming not only corresponding to a truth, but becoming adequate to it. And you're right, on earth, we can never be as adequate to a truth as, for instance, God can, who knows all things completely, fully, and adequately. That's why there's always more to learn. But there is objective falsehood. Yes?